Most cities in the UK have a student neighbourhood, an area of the city that just by having the misfortune of being next to a university is almost exclusively populated by students. Leeds has Headingley, Manchester has Fallowfield, and Birmingham has Selly Oak. Well, Selly Oak is actually over here. This area is actually called Bournebrook, but the presence of the station and the growing importance and larger population of this side of the tracks compared to this side meant that the name Selly Oak eventually spread to cover all of this. This section of road is almost always just called Selly High Street, even though officially it's just a section of Bristol Road. The station was built in 1876, and Selly Oak grew up as a commuter suburb on top of farmland and cattle grazing land around the station. It's quite typical of Victorian terraced housing, built on a loose grid of streets, enclosing long and thin blocks. A subtle Victorian grandeur comes through in tiny architectural details that tie the buildings together. Most of these houses are 2 or 3 stories and have ample garden space, and all of them are within a short walk of a high street full of shops and restaurants. This model of terraced residential streets branching off a commercial high street is very common in Victorian suburbs, and is extremely successful at providing all the services you would need on a daily basis within walking distance from your house, while keeping residential areas mostly quiet and relaxed. Throughout the streets of Selly, there are low-impact commercial and industrial uses that provide interest, offer people the chance to work locally, and keep the area alive during the day. But if you can't find what you need here, a bus that comes every 5 minutes and a train that comes every 10 to 15 minutes can take you into the city centre. Selly Oak is one of the densest areas in Birmingham, at almost 9,000 people per square kilometre. This is about double the Birmingham average and significantly higher than typical Victorian commuter suburbs elsewhere in the country. So, how does Selly Oak do it? How does a neighbourhood of mostly individual houses on their own plots of land have enough density to support so many services and amenities? It comes down to what I call hidden density. There are far more housing units here than you would think. While the streetscape looks like this, tucked away on the edges are places like this. All over Selly, there are houses in courtyards and down alleys, round the back of other houses and in gardens. This hidden density silently and invisibly adds to the housing stock and pushes up the population density so there are more people to support local businesses. And they're beautiful too. These courtyards and alleys are quiet, away from roads. They're secluded from the eyes of passers-by. They're cosy and personal, and naturally discourage intruders due to the feeling that you're entering someone else's personal space. And they're dense, providing housing for more people in less space. And all of that with individual houses, where the residents can still own their own plot of land and still have their own gardens. It's amazing how much you can fit in so little space if you don't have to accommodate roads. Modest but consistent density is often more effective than sputters of high density in amongst dead space. And to push up Selly Oak's average density even more, there are a handful of flats. There are a few blocks of flats scattered about here, but there are also flats over all of these shops. These particular small residential spaces are not glamorous, and it's absolutely fine if you don't want to live somewhere like this. But there are loads of people that are happy to live here, and they bump up the population density, which benefits everyone. Compact spaces with minimal road space go a long way towards reducing car use and encouraging active lifestyles. Selly is one of the few areas in Birmingham where parking minimums are not mandatory. Government policy still specifies minimum parking requirements for new residential areas in most of the country. The argument being that reducing parking doesn't stop people owning cars, and if you don't provide enough parking, people will park inappropriately. But this is obviously ridiculous. If the only parking available is street parking, and your house is narrower than the width of a car, obviously this is going to naturally restrict car ownership to less than one per house. If there's nowhere to put a car, people will simply find a way to manage without one. Selly Oak has existed for hundreds of years with parking below the minimum standards, and it hasn't exploded yet. In fact, it's the opposite. Selly is thriving in comparison with places that have bowed to the car's insatiable hunger for more and more space. But Selly Oak is an island of beauty in a sea of treachery. Wade just a bit too far from its shores, and you might stumble across. On the other side of the canal, this brownfield land was sat waiting for development. Surely, as a property developer whose job it is to know this stuff, when you're building a new housing estate, you would look at the nearby area and what makes it nice to live in, and emulate that to make sure your estate is also nice to live in and blends into its local context, right? This plot of land is deeply intertwined with Birmingham's rich industrial history. In 1870, this was a workhouse for the poor. By the 1910s, it had grown into a fully fledged infirmary complex, which became Selly Oak Hospital sometime in the 20th century. It was as late as 2011 that the hospital operations moved to the nearby Queen Elizabeth Hospital, and the land was sold off for housing. And this is what we ended up with, a distinctly soulless sea of red brick cubes. There aren't any shops or services here. The streets are totally dead and dominated by car parking. There's no sense of place, and nothing notable to make anyone feel like part of something or proud to live here. This layout is completely incoherent. You can barely get 3 buildings in a row without it being interrupted by parking or a blank wall. Look at this block. It's like a random scattering of buildings. There's no defined street frontage. If you squint your eyes, you can't even tell where the street ends and the property line begins. And look how they treated the original buildings they didn't demolish. The original workhouse building from 1870 is now wedged diagonally between these 2 rows of houses, and is inconveniently fenced off from the rest of the development. The original hospital water tower is awkwardly standing in the middle of nowhere, a dead patch of grass on one side and a driveway on the other, like someone caught in the middle of a conversation at a party waiting for the chance to leave. The austere tower looks so hilariously out of place next to this plastic semi-detached house that it almost feels like a prank. It would be funny if it wasn't so disrespectful. Think of all the stories that happened on this little plot of land. The people that turned up on this workhouse doorstep with nowhere to go, the lives begun and ended in the hospital here. And look at it now. This could be anywhere. I mean, look at this location. A canal front site, 15 minutes from the centre of the second biggest city in the UK. This land is just too valuable to throw away like this. And now it's been built on, it's almost impossible to change, which is why it's so important to get this stuff right from the start. So, what could they have done instead? The water tower is a ready-made local monument. It could have been the centrepiece of a public square, the focal point of a whole new community, with shops and cafes around the edge of the square. Or even without changing the layout, just being respectful of the local architecture and design motifs would have improved the development by 100 times. Bourneville Village, just a few minutes away, was a village built for the workers of the nearby Bourneville factory. Imitating this architecture would not only have made a much more beautiful and pleasant neighbourhood, but it would have tied the development into the history of the local area. Or, here's an idea. Why did the Selly Oak Hospital have to be demolished at all? At least some of the buildings could have been turned into flats or terraced houses. They could have kept just one of the wings as a community centre or something, as a respectful nod to the history of the site. But developers need a blank slate so they can build their standardised house types to squeeze every penny of profit out, I guess.
Honestly, making this video, it's hard to know who's to blame for obviously dysfunctional housing developments getting built. Is it the council? It seems like a hardline prescriptivist position is not one the council should take, and it would be hard to make policy that's both rigid and works for every site in every situation. And their hands are mostly tied by government policy and land targets. Is it the developers? You would think they have a strong financial incentive to build as densely as possible. More units sold means more money for them. And even without taking into account density, developers have a vested interest in making places that are nice. A house in a place that nobody wants to live will sell for less money than a house in a place that's nice to live in. But this business model strongly discourages innovation. Renovating an old building or building something new is risky. The costs are more variable and the market sale price is less predictable. Whereas building on a blank slate is very safe. You can use standard house types, you know exactly how much each one is going to cost to build, and you know exactly how much each one is going to sell for. Or is it public attitudes? As I said before, this part of Birmingham is one of few areas that has no parking minimums, and yet this site was still built with the car as number one. Maybe the developers know a house with space for 3 cars will sell for more than a house with space for 1 car, even if it's in an area where you don't really need a car to live. We're about a century in now to the suburban experiment, and generations of people have grown up believing having a big house and a fancy car is the ultimate symbol of success. For some people, a car-based suburban lifestyle is all they've ever known. What I do know is that something needs to change. As we build more and more housing to support a growing population, we need to decide what we want the cities of the future to look like. Do we want sterile neighbourhoods that leech identity off their surroundings? Or do we want vibrant, varied neighbourhoods that promote a sense of community and that people are proud to be from? We live on an island which really does not have much space. We need to make sure that when we're building on land, we're using it to its absolute fullest potential.